I'd like to thank C2G on behalf of the United Nations Economic Commission for Africa, and in particularly on behalf of our Executive Secretary, Vera Songwe, because I think this partnership is very important because it's about recognizing how these kind of issues will affect ultimately those that are perhaps the least involved in these negotiations or in these discussions about carbon removal. African countries are on the periphery of the discussions of this type, and they will be very much impacted. And it's important from these approaches that there is, first of all, an understanding of where we are going, what are the options that are available, and that we take a development-based approach. I think that Janos said it extremely well, that the interrelationship between climate change and the SDGs is indivisible. And the challenges that we are facing are also linked to opportunities. But those opportunities have to be seized now. And Thelma in particular highlighted how warming is set to exceed 1.5 degrees in the near term. And we are definitely not on track for the 1.5 degrees and will unfortunately reach 3.2 degrees by the end of the century. This has impacts because it makes many of the climate impacts, the worst impacts, irreversible. And we will note from the IPCC 6 report that warming is also not uniform, meaning that certain regions feel it more and it has more impact. And I'd like to cite also research done by the UNECA, which has shown that for every 2 degrees of warming above pre-industrial levels, Africa is losing around 5% of GDP. And linked to climate-related disasters, African countries are spending up to 9% of GDP. We also appreciated very much the assessment of solar radiation modification opportunities presented by Ines, and looking at the risk-based approach, looking at what are the opportunities of deploying such technologies to absolutely accelerate the issue of reducing global warming, but also the risks that are associated, in particular, the risk of conflict and without regulations. And again, the risk that developing countries will be left by the wayside in terms of the regulation, may even be facing regulations that are not to their interest, and hence the importance of building that capacity of engagement. And James Wangi built on a lot of the work that we have been also doing together to emphasize how Africa can sequester up to 30% of the world's need for carbon removal. And this places Africa very much at the forefront of the opportunity for nature-based carbon removal. And we fully agree with him that there is an opportunity to maximize the impact in terms of biodiversity protection as well as climate resilience. And it's important that we look at this as well through the lens of livelihoods. But all solutions must be integrated and must link to each other. And we particularly appreciated the reference to oceans and their role of carbon dioxide removal, because more than any other element, it shows how a shared space should be managed by multiple countries, and that this requires looking beyond existing mechanisms. At the crux of the conversation today has been a question about equity, the question of who is paying the most currently due to the impact of carbon, and unfortunately it's those that have contributed the least. Who will pay for carbon removal? How do we develop systems which are fair for carbon removal? And I think the answer is all of the above. There has to be investment in the technology that makes it possible, but perhaps even more importantly, there has to be investment in activities that really build resilience among those populations that are the most vulnerable.